Did you really think I wouldn't notice? Victoria's voice floated from the doorway, casual yet sharp, and for a heartbeat Margaret froze in place, her hands still on the edge of the dining table. The sunlight filtered through the half-closed blinds, slanting across the room in warm streaks that did nothing to soften the tension in the air. She had been preparing breakfast, carefully arranging slices of fresh melon and whole wheat toast on the plates, the aroma of brewed coffee mingling with the crisp morning air. Margaret looked at David, who sat quietly at the table scrolling through his phone, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrent that had suddenly shifted in their kitchen. The calm of her home, the familiar clatter of utensils, and the hum of the refrigerator now felt strained, like a stage set for a scene that she hadn't auditioned for. Victoria's eyes flicked toward Margaret, a faint, knowing smile on her lips that Margaret had seen before in fleeting moments at family dinners, a smile that hid more than it revealed. Margaret's mind raced through the past weeks, the subtle changes in routines, the unexplained phone calls, the little evasions that now coalesced into a pattern too deliberate to ignore. She let her hands rest on the table, fingers tracing the edge as if grounding herself in the solidity of reality, while her gaze swept over the morning light, the chipped mug with her name painted on it, the crumbs that spoke of ordinary meals now seeming like props in a hidden narrative. The words from Victoria echoed again, this time in Margaret's internal voice, sharpening her awareness. They think I'm unaware. They think I'll react impulsively. But she didn't move to defend herself, didn't rise in alarm. Instead, she took a measured breath and let the quiet swell between them, letting the moment stretch just enough to feel the weight of it, the almost imperceptible shift in atmosphere that spoke volumes. She remembered the times she had noticed similar small deceptions in the past, chalked up to oversight or misunderstanding, but this felt different, calculated, precise. Margaret's eyes softened as they swept past David's distracted glance to the sunlight spilling across the counter, and she allowed herself the briefest flash of satisfaction, knowing that she could choose her response, that she wasn't trapped in reaction. Every plate, every fork, every cup had been set with intention, a ritual of normalcy in a household now tinged with unspoken motives. The faint hum of the refrigerator seemed to keep time with her heartbeat as she considered the delicate balance of power in the room, the unspoken roles that each family member played, and the invisible script that Victoria seemed to have written without permission. Margaret's reflection in the polished surface of the toaster caught her eye for a moment, her silver hair neatly pinned back, the light catching the subtle lines that told the story of decades lived, of patience and observation honed to a fine edge. She allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile, one that held no triumph, no anger, only clarity. In this quiet, charged morning, she recognized the stage, the players, and the invisible strings, and she made the silent decision to watch, to measure, to wait. The sunlight shifted, brushing her hand as she poured the coffee, each drop landing precisely in the center of the cup, the ritual of pouring ordinary moments becoming an act of careful observation. Margaret did not speak, did not move abruptly, only let her eyes linger a moment longer on Victoria's poised figure before looking away, toward the window, the sky a clear, pale blue. She noted the way the shadows fell across the kitchen tiles, the way the light angled across the table, and she allowed herself to catalog, to record, to witness without interference. This was her morning, her observation, and she held it with the deliberate calm of someone who knew that patience often revealed more than reaction ever could. Margaret moved quietly to the living room, her steps deliberate, the soft thud of her slippers against the hardwood floor echoing lightly in the empty morning. The sun poured through the large bay windows, illuminating the shelves lined with family photographs and keepsakes that had accumulated over decades. Each frame, each trinket, told a story of care, celebration, and love, yet today, they felt almost alien to her, like markers of a life being carefully curated without her input. She sank into the armchair near the window, placing her hands on the armrests, letting her eyes drift across the room, noting the subtle shifts in shadows and light that changed with the rising sun. David had returned to his work, his presence nearly a ghost as he navigated emails on his tablet, and Victoria had moved to the kitchen, busying herself with small tasks that seemed purposeful yet detached. Margaret allowed herself a slow exhale, listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling, the faint hum of the air conditioning, the tick of the grandfather clock marking each passing minute. Her gaze fell upon the mantelpiece, where candles stood unlit and a vase of freshly cut tulips caught the sunlight, their petals delicate and vibrant, a contrast to the tension she felt lurking beneath the surface of her family interactions. She recalled mornings spent in this very room, the air filled with laughter and conversation, the aroma of freshly baked bread and coffee creating a sense of warmth and belonging. Now, the air seemed heavier, filled with an almost imperceptible distance that made each breath measured, each gesture deliberate. Margaret reached for a small notebook that she kept tucked beside the armchair, a collection of thoughts, observations, and reminders that had grown over the years. She flipped it open, tracing her finger along the neat handwriting she had maintained, each note a marker of careful attention to the dynamics around her, moments she had quietly catalogued but never spoken aloud. She reflected on the subtle cues she had begun to notice recently, a glance that lingered too long, an unspoken hesitation, a slightly altered tone of voice. These small anomalies, once dismissed as inconsequential, now aggregated into a pattern that demanded her awareness. Margaret allowed herself a small, satisfied nod, recognizing the value of patience and observation, understanding that knowledge gained silently often held more power than words spoken hastily. She sipped from the cup of tea she had poured earlier, the warmth grounding her as she considered the day ahead, each plan, each movement calculated to maintain composure while she continued to observe. The house, bathed in the morning light, seemed almost aware of her attentiveness, each object, each shadow reinforcing the quiet authority she claimed in this space. She watched as Victoria moved methodically through the kitchen, adjusting items on the counter with precision, yet unaware that Margaret's eyes captured every subtle action. Margaret's mind mapped the room, the people, the interactions, each detail stored with care, a mental ledger of actions and intentions that would inform her responses in the coming hours. The quiet was not emptiness, she realized, but a canvas on which the intricate dynamics of her household were being revealed, a stage set for careful observation, where she held the center by remaining patient and vigilant. Time passed in measured increments, the rhythm of domestic life continuing around her, yet Margaret remained poised, grounded in the knowledge that understanding preceded any decision, that the subtle art of watching and listening was her most powerful tool. Her eyes rested briefly on the framed photograph of her late husband, the gentle expression frozen in time, and she drew a quiet strength from the memory, a reminder of the clarity and patience that had guided her through decades of family life, reinforcing her resolve to observe, to understand, and to act with deliberate calm when the moment demanded it. Margaret rose from the armchair and walked to the kitchen counter, her movements measured and deliberate, her eyes scanning the room for any subtle shifts in posture or expression. Victoria was arranging the morning mail into a neat pile, her fingers brushing the envelopes with careful precision, and Margaret observed the way the sunlight glinted off the polished counters, highlighting the meticulous order of the space. David remained seated at the table, absorbed in reviewing the financial statements on his tablet, occasionally adjusting his glasses, unaware of the careful scrutiny under which Margaret placed him. The quiet in the house was profound, broken only by the soft clink of silverware and the distant hum of the refrigerator, and Margaret allowed herself to notice every small detail, every hesitation in Victoria's movements, the brief pauses between her words as she muttered polite comments to David. She thought back to afternoons spent here with her children, the aroma of baked cookies filling the air, the laughter bouncing off the walls, and she contrasted it with this morning, where the silence was heavier, weighted with intention. Margaret reached for a notebook she kept beside the sink, its pages filled with observations, reminders, and reflections accumulated over years, and she flipped it open to a fresh page, noting down the sequence of movements and words she had just witnessed. The sunlight shifted slightly, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor, and Margaret traced them with her gaze, allowing her mind to process the patterns of behavior she had catalogued, the subtle signs of tension and unspoken motives. She sipped from her cup of tea, the warmth steadying her as she considered the subtle power dynamics at play, understanding that influence and control often moved quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the spaces between conversations and gestures. Margaret's eyes lingered on the small details, the way Victoria tilted her head, the slight furrow in David's brow, the delicate placement of utensils, each minor act contributing to the larger picture she was beginning to discern. She allowed the morning to unfold in its quiet rhythm, the sunlight now brighter, glinting off the chrome handles and glass surfaces, casting reflections that seemed to echo the duality of appearance and intention within the household. Margaret made a note of the patterns, the way David and Victoria interacted, the measured pauses and inflections that betrayed small fragments of truth. While she remained outwardly calm, her expression serene, unmarked by suspicion or anger. Her mind considered the history of the household, the routines, the little idiosyncrasies of daily life, and how each could be read as a clue to the current situation. The act of watching, of patiently cataloging, became her instrument, and she held it with quiet authority, understanding that clarity and insight often came through observation rather than immediate reaction. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, each second a reminder that time revealed patterns and that patience was her greatest ally. Margaret exhaled softly, her hands folded lightly on the counter, her gaze sweeping once more across the room, noting the interplay of light and shadow, the subtle expressions, the careful movements, and she felt the satisfaction of awareness, the power of understanding what lay beneath the surface while maintaining a composed exterior, ready to act with precision when the moment demanded it. Margaret lingered by the window, letting the morning light spill over her hands as she traced the outline of the sill with careful attention. She reflected on the subtle moments over the past few weeks that had gradually shaped her understanding of the household, the quiet patterns that spoke volumes once one learned to look closely. The coffee in her cup had cooled slightly, steam now curling gently toward the ceiling, and she took a deliberate sip, savoring the warmth and allowing herself a moment of stillness. Victoria moved across the room, arranging decorative items on the shelves with precise, calculated movements, the faintest crease in her brow betraying a thought process Margaret could almost read like an open page. David remained at the table, absorbed in his correspondence, oblivious to the tension that threaded through the quiet morning, and Margaret noted the way he occasionally glanced up, the brief pauses and subtle shifts in posture revealing a latent preoccupation. Margaret allowed her mind to wander back to earlier family gatherings, recalling laughter, casual conversations, and the easy rhythms of meals shared together, the sense of warmth and connection now layered with distance and observation. She considered the dynamics that had always existed between them, the little compromises and concessions made over the years, and how those seemingly innocuous choices had contributed to the present complexity. Each photograph on the walls, each framed memory, spoke of effort and care, yet Margaret now saw them in a new light, as markers of presence and absence, highlighting what was truly valued and what was overlooked. She traced her eyes over the arrangement of furniture, the light bouncing off polished surfaces, the subtle patterns of movement, cataloging every detail with a meticulous eye. The quiet became almost tangible, filled with possibilities and latent truths, and Margaret embraced it, recognizing that clarity often emerged from patience and careful attention rather than reaction. She picked up a pen and opened her notebook, jotting down observations in a neat, flowing script, the ink capturing not just facts but the subtleties of expression, timing, and unspoken intention. As she paused, the sound of a soft breeze through the open window brought a shift in the atmosphere, the curtains moving gently and casting dancing shadows on the floor, emphasizing the interplay of light and perception. Margaret felt a quiet satisfaction in her methodical approach, understanding that insight gained through observation would provide the advantage she needed when the right moment to act arrived. Every movement, every glance, and every pause became part of a carefully constructed map of the household's dynamics, and she embraced the role of the attentive observer, fully aware that understanding preceded any deliberate action. She noted the timing of interactions, the rhythm of conversation, and the gestures that seemed ordinary but were laden with subtle meaning, reinforcing her confidence that knowledge acquired silently was a potent form of power. Margaret allowed herself a deep, steady breath, grounding in the awareness of her own presence, of the history she carried with her, and of the patience she had honed over decades. She watched, she recorded, she processed, and she held herself poised, knowing that the careful accumulation of insight would guide her through the unfolding day with measured clarity and calm authority, maintaining her composure as the household moved through its ordinary routines while she quietly charted its hidden patterns. Margaret set the notebook aside and allowed her gaze to wander over the breakfast dishes, still warm from the oven, each plate carefully arranged as if nothing unusual had occurred. She observed Victoria moving around the kitchen, her steps precise, almost rehearsed, as she aligned silverware and straightened napkins, the faint sound of metal brushing against porcelain punctuating the quiet space. David, absorbed in reviewing the mail, occasionally glanced up, his attention fragmented between the envelopes and the small digital tablet he held, unaware that Margaret noticed the subtle signs of distraction and unease. The morning light shifted slowly through the blinds, casting elongated patterns across the floor, and Margaret tracked the way shadows fell over Victoria's hands, the tilt of her head, the brief pauses that suggested thoughtfulness beyond the casual movements she displayed. Memories of earlier family breakfasts surfaced unbidden, the warm conversations and casual teasing now reframed by the current tension, each recollection sharpening her awareness of the changes that had crept into the household over the months. Margaret allowed herself a measured sip of tea, the warmth a small comfort as she catalogued the rhythm of interactions, the interplay of glances, and the subtle shifts in tone that signaled intent beneath the surface. She noted the careful placement of items on the countertop, the deliberate pacing of movements, and the absence of spontaneous gestures that once characterized Victoria's presence, each action now a calculated measure that Margaret recognized with clarity. Her eyes moved to the framed photographs lining the kitchen walls, capturing moments of laughter and celebration, and she reflected on the contrast between the warmth depicted in those images and the restrained, measured behavior she now observed. The quiet seemed to stretch, allowing her to witness the nuances of timing and emphasis in conversation, the barely perceptible hesitations that spoke volumes, and she recorded these in her mind with meticulous attention, understanding that knowledge of such patterns would provide insight when decisions needed to be made. Margaret felt a sense of calm authority settle over her, the awareness of details, the patient observation, and the mental mapping of interactions creating a quiet power she had cultivated over years of careful attention to her family's dynamics. Every gesture, every glance, every pause contributed to an intricate understanding of the household, and she held that knowledge without haste or reaction, appreciating that patience would reveal the deeper intentions behind ordinary appearances. She allowed herself to notice the subtle shifts in David's posture, the fleeting expressions that flickered across Victoria's face, and the unspoken communications that passed between them, cataloging each with the deliberate attention of someone who understood that observation preceded action. Margaret's breathing remained steady, her posture poised, and she embraced the stillness of the morning as a space in which clarity and understanding could develop, each small detail reinforcing her awareness of the true currents running through the household and preparing her mind for the careful steps she would take when the right moment arrived. Margaret moved toward the living room again, her steps quiet, almost imperceptible on the polished hardwood floor. She observed the sunlight shifting through the curtains, casting soft patterns on the rug, the gentle illumination highlighting every subtle movement in the room. Victoria adjusted the cushions on the sofa with careful precision, her fingers brushing the fabric deliberately, while David sat across from her, leafing through a magazine, his expression casual but distracted. Margaret allowed herself to notice every small gesture, the tilt of a head, the slight hesitation in a step, the rhythm of breathing, cataloging each in her mind without any outward reaction. She reflected on past mornings spent here, the sound of laughter, the warmth of shared coffee and toast, and contrasted it with the current quiet, which felt loaded with intent and undercurrents she had learned to detect over years of patient observation. Margaret sipped from her cup, the warmth grounding her as she considered the subtle nuances of voice, posture, and eye movement that revealed hidden truths, understanding that these small cues were more telling than any direct words. She traced her gaze over the room, noting the alignment of books on the shelf, the angle of light across the table, and the careful arrangement of items that Victoria maintained, each element contributing to a pattern Margaret was beginning to decode. The quiet tick of the clock marked the passing minutes, and Margaret welcomed it, letting the rhythm of the household unfold while she quietly absorbed every detail, aware that patience allowed insight to crystallize in ways immediate action never could. Her thoughts drifted to the past decisions, the moments of trust and reliance, and she compared them with the subtle discrepancies she now observed, piecing together an understanding of motives and priorities. She held the notebook she had brought earlier in her lap, fingers lightly resting on the cover, her mind compiling notes, impressions, and observations in an intricate mental ledger. Margaret noticed the slight shifts in David's gaze, the almost imperceptible adjustments in Victoria's posture, the small hesitations in her steps as she moved through the room, and she mentally cataloged each, appreciating the clarity that came from watching without interruption. She allowed herself a brief exhale, savoring the calm authority she held simply by observing, the quiet patience that lent weight to every decision she might make later. Each element of the morning, the sunlight, the shadows, the objects, the movements, became part of a larger map, one that Margaret could read with precision, understanding that knowledge gained in silence often outweighed any impulsive confrontation. She remained seated, poised and attentive, absorbing the subtleties of interaction, the rhythm of daily life, and the invisible currents that shaped her household, knowing that the careful accumulation of insight would guide her when the moment arrived to act with deliberate purpose and measured clarity. Margaret settled back into the armchair by the window, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on the arms as she allowed the soft morning light to illuminate the room around her. She watched the way Victoria moved with meticulous care, adjusting the placement of a vase, straightening a photo frame, her actions precise but somehow lacking warmth, and Margaret noted the deliberate attention given to appearances, a contrast to the subtle tension lingering beneath the surface. David sipped from his coffee mug, eyes scanning the headlines on his tablet, unaware that Margaret absorbed each small detail with a quiet intensity, the tilt of his head, the pause in his breath, the slight tightening of his jaw registering as part of a larger pattern. The kitchen seemed almost suspended in time. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the wall clock, and the occasional creak of the floorboards creating a rhythm that Margaret found grounding, a steady tempo against which she could measure each movement and expression. Her gaze traveled over the room, cataloging the positions of chairs, the alignment of the table, settings, the angle of light reflecting off polished surfaces, understanding that each element contributed to a broader story she was quietly piecing together. Margaret allowed her mind to trace the series of interactions, remembering the subtle discrepancies in conversations over the past weeks, the unspoken cues, the way small favors or gestures were timed to convey a sense of normalcy while concealing intent. She traced her finger along the edge of the armrest, a small, deliberate motion, letting her thoughts organize themselves, building a mental map of influence, priorities, and unvoiced ambitions. Outside, the wind shifted gently, rustling the leaves against the window pane, and Margaret noted the rhythm of the world continuing around her, each external sound a counterpoint to the internal assessment she maintained. She considered the subtle interplay of power and attention in her household, the careful choreography of daily life, and the invisible threads of influence that Victoria and David wove between themselves, while she remained silent, collecting insight through observation alone. The sunlight moved gradually across the floor, elongating shadows, and Margaret watched as these patterns changed with the passing minutes, each alteration a reminder of the subtle shifts that could reveal intent and character. She reflected on the patience required to truly understand these dynamics, the calm endurance needed to remain outwardly serene while mentally constructing a detailed picture of the household's undercurrents. Every slight glance, every microgesture, every measured word passed under her scrutiny, cataloged, and remembered for the appropriate moment when understanding could be transformed into careful action. Margaret's breathing remained steady, her mind alert, her awareness heightened by the quiet, the light, and the ongoing interplay of actions and reactions in her home, fully conscious that her knowledge accumulated in stillness would become a source of clarity and strength when the right time arrived to navigate the complexities of her family with deliberate composure. Margaret remained in the armchair, her hands folded lightly in her lap, her gaze sweeping across the living room as the morning light shifted, casting longer shadows along the carpet and walls. The quiet in the house was deliberate, almost tangible, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional scrape of a chair as Victoria moved with measured care, straightening magazines and adjusting decorative items on the coffee table. David was now flipping through papers, his expression attentive yet distant, and Margaret noted the slight creases in his forehead, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his focus flickered between documents and his tablet. Unaware of the careful scrutiny she applied to every motion, she allowed herself to notice the minute details of Victoria's movements, the way her fingers lingered on an edge, the gentle tilt of her head, the precise pacing as she navigated the room, each subtle action revealing intention without needing to speak a word. Margaret reflected on the layers of patience and observation that had brought her to this point, the countless mornings and afternoons she had quietly cataloged interactions, gestures, and words, forming an intricate understanding of the household's dynamics. She sipped her tea, the warmth steadying her, and observed the interplay of light across the room, the way reflections from the window pane danced across surfaces, subtly highlighting the careful choreography of daily life around her. Memories surfaced of earlier days, filled with laughter and spontaneous conversation, contrasting sharply with the calculated calm of the present moment, deepening her awareness of the shifts in behavior and priorities. Margaret traced a line on the notebook she had brought with her, noting patterns, timings, and sequences of interaction, cataloging even the smallest anomalies that might otherwise be overlooked. The gentle clink of a cup being placed on the countertop by Victoria, the faint shuffle of papers from David, the soft creak of the floorboards as someone moved, all became part of the map Margaret was constructing, a record of precision that required no words. She considered the subtle tensions, the unspoken signals, the ways in which intention and attention were being directed, and she recognized the importance of continued vigilance, of observing without interruption, of allowing the details to reveal the true currents at work. The morning sun continued its slow progression across the room, illuminating dust motes that floated in the air, each tiny movement serving as a reminder of the depth of her awareness. Margaret felt the quiet authority that came from understanding, from the deliberate act of watching, knowing that the careful collection of these observations would guide any necessary action in the hours to come. She allowed herself a steady exhale, appreciating the stillness, the clarity of perception, and the patience that empowered her to remain calm while discerning the hidden patterns and intentions in her home, fully poised to respond with deliberate precision when the time arrived. Margaret remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap, observing the subtle movements around the living room with unbroken attention. The sunlight had shifted, brushing golden light across the sofa where Victoria now adjusted a cushion, her movements deliberate yet revealing glimpses of tension in the slight tightness of her shoulders. David leaned back in his chair, reviewing documents, occasionally flipping a page, the rhythm of his activity providing a predictable cadence that Margaret quietly mapped in her mind. She allowed herself to note the smallest details, the tilt of Victoria's head, the way her fingers lingered on the edge of a book, the brief flicker of expression across David's face when he glanced toward her. Each subtle motion reinforcing the larger picture of intentions and unspoken dynamics she had been observing for hours. Margaret traced the patterns of the morning, comparing current behavior with past interactions, recalling the casual warmth of family meals now replaced by careful, measured gestures and the soft undertone of scrutiny in every glance exchanged. She sipped her tea, the heat steadying her focus, and allowed the quiet of the room to sharpen her perception. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint scrape of a chair leg, the soft tick of the wall clock, becoming a marker of timing, rhythm, and coordination within the household. The photographs lining the shelves caught the light, depicting celebrations, birthdays, and shared moments, and Margaret reflected on how these images, once vibrant with spontaneity, now stood as silent witnesses to the carefully orchestrated interactions she had been cataloging. Her mind connected the dots between words spoken softly in passing, gestures repeated subtly, and pauses in conversation, constructing a layered understanding of priorities and influence. Margaret allowed herself a measured smile, the expression calm and deliberate, for she understood the value of patience and observation, of accumulating insight without interference, knowing that clarity was often revealed through quiet attention rather than immediate action. She glanced at the clock, noting the slow progress of time, and recognized that the dynamics she was witnessing could inform every decision she would make, giving her the advantage of foresight and preparedness. The sunlight now illuminated the corners of the room more fully, revealing textures and nuances in the furnishings, the shadows cast by objects serving as visual cues that reinforced her mental map of the environment. Margaret's breathing remained steady, her posture relaxed, yet alert, and she felt the accumulation of knowledge she had gained throughout the morning coalesce into a sense of quiet authority. Every subtle motion, every fleeting glance, every measured pause became a piece of information, a signal, a clue, and she held it all with patience, poised to act with deliberate precision when the time required it. She remained fully present, her awareness encompassing the room, the people, and the interactions, absorbing each nuance with the calm certainty that insight gathered silently would ultimately provide clarity, direction, and control in the unfolding hours of the day.